and welcome to GenFriends. I'm your host, Cheri Hudson Passey from Carolina Girl Genealogy, and as usual, I have a fabulous panel. I've got Bernice Bennett, who's here from Genealogist-Cece. Hi, Bernice.
Hi there.
So good to have you on.
Good
Welcome,
to be
welcome. Mary Kircher Roddy from MKR Genealogy is here. Hi, Mary.
Hi, everybody.
Always good to see you.
Great to be here.
Thanks for being here. Laura Hedgecock is here from Treasure Chest of Memories. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Always good to have you here too. And
Thanks.
yeah, last but not least, we have Dan Earl, our family history guy. Hi, Dan.
Hello.
So good to have you guys always show up and come talk. This is wonderful. We are continuing our series of talking about finding your roots and the things that we can learn from genealogy TV show. You know, it's really fun to watch them, but if we're observant, then we'll see methodologies, record types maybe we didn't think of, strategies we didn't think of. And so that's what we like to talk about, the episode, what happened on it, but what we noticed that we can use and learn from it. So this week's episode was episode 12, and it featured actress Téa Leoni and Joe Madison, who is a radio host. So these episodes, these two celebrities were shown in a previous season, so it's just been recut. And you know, sometimes you can watch these things over and over and over, and you learn something new every time. And I learned a couple of things new that I missed both times I've seen it. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So I just wanted to start and just say that the one thing I liked about this episode was the fact that it was a DNA episode. I mean, I don't think Joe realized his was going to be a DNA episode when they started, but Téa did, and she came specifically looking for answers for her biological grandparents. But Cece Moore, our friend Cece Moore, was on the show, and she gave some steps that I thought were really good. Just some basic steps for DNA research, and I thought I'd go over those really quick, and then I'm just going to turn the time over to the panel to get their thoughts on the show. But the first thing, of course, she said to do when you're looking for biological connections is to look at the records. What do the records say? And sometimes I think we're so busy jumping into DNA, we forget that we really do need to look at records. They go hand in hand, the DNA and the records. So look for those records. After you've done the DNA testing, of course, then you need to look for matches. And then you need to look at the matches and see where those connections are coming in. Build the trees and see if you can find, in her case, she was looking for the common couples, the common ancestral couples in the lines. And then when she found those, then she built the trees down to see who all those descendants were, and then see who could possibly be the biological parents that she was looking for. She had to look at, again, records to see where people were living, because you can't have a child unless you can find out people were together at a certain time in a certain place. So all of those things come together to build a DNA case. And I just thought it was really good that they kind of step by step, because I know a lot of people jump in, they take that test, and then they don't know what to do afterwards. So I just thought it was really nice that they kind of just took, no, it's not that easy. I understand that. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but it is the process, really, if you think about it. It's how we determine, you know, those DNA matches, those biological people that we're looking for, those biological relations. So I just thought that was really cool that they kind of just did that step by step. And I was like, oh yeah, I do that. Okay, yeah, okay. Because I try with the DNA really hard, you know. I've got a lot of learning to do. But with that, who would like to just jump in and start talking about how they felt about the episode? Dan.
Yeah, so one of the kind of going along with what you were talking about with the DNA and the testing and the steps. One thing that I really appreciated that they emphasized was that they got Téa Leoni's mom's permission.
Yes.
They could have done what they needed to do without that permission. They had Téa's DNA. Mm-hmm. They could have adjusted the percentages and still gotten that information, but they still sought the consent mm-hmm. of other people involved. And so you said sometimes we just jump right to DNA, and especially for new genealogists, we don't
Right.
think how what we find can affect other people. And we may not even be, at least Teo was aware that there was an adoption in her family.
Right.
Many people go into DNA testing
Yes.
thinking that there's not, and then they find out that there is, or there's a
Yeah.
misattributed parentage, or
Mm-hmm.
some other thing that they discover as a part of that. And so we need to make sure as genealogists that we are both educated and educating other people to make sure that we're seeking the consent of everyone
Yes.
that could be affected by unexpected results.
Right.
And they really made it a point, and and I really appreciated that, having dealt with some cases with client work where some very sensitive things came up
Yes.
and that were unexpected. We always need to make sure that we're involving everyone in that discussion before the testing happens, because once the cat's out of the bag, you can't put it back.
You can't put it back in. Well, and that's what happened too with Joe's case.
Mhm.
And look how it was handled. They pulled back. They weren't going to reveal that while they were filming. I mean,
Yep.
can you imagine how that would have felt to him? But they gave him the respect of a phone call first, explaining what they'd found, that his line was not what he thought it was, and there was a biological, was it grandfather, father, or grandfather? Father, yes, father, that they needed to find, and how he felt about that. And then he gave him permission. He said, let's go for it. Let's do this thing. And so people have different responses to things like that. And I know, Bernice, you wanted to kind of talk about the emotional side of DNA.
Before we go to that, though, just to piggyback on what you had just said,
Mm-hmm.
I talked to one of the advisors from Adoption DNA.
Uh-huh.
And after I talked to him, I would always tell an adoptee to go talk to them first. But basically, his advice to people is don't go ahead with the testing if you're not ready for every possible,
Oh,
every and
absolutely.
any possible outcome.
Absolutely. Because you
If
just don't know.
Right. If you go into it with your hopes set on one thing,
Mm-hmm.
he said maybe you shouldn't go into it.
Oh, I agree totally. Bernice?
Right. And I mean, it's almost piggybacking on what Laura just said. When you start talking about DNA, you have to recognize there is an emotional side to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we saw tears.
Yes.
We saw tears coming out because at that particular moment, she was actually, reality hit her.
Right.
Reality hit her that,
Right.
wait a minute, my mother does have a mother. My
Mhm.
mother does have a father.
Right.
And with Joe, we're dealing with family secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you, prepare yourself to be ready for those family secrets, especially when Pa is not Pa?
Right.
You have to go through those emotions
Right.
of saying, oh, do I really want to know? Or do I want to just leave it alone and be happy with what I grew up with? And so,
Exactly. When they showed Joe that picture of his father, he said,
Yeah.
I've seen him before. It wasn't anybody that he remembered hanging around, but he had seen that man before. And so I think he handled that whole thing very, very well. I think he did. I think he handled it like, well, that's my story. I'm going to have to deal with it. Mary, you wanted to say something.
I was just going to comment that what you just said about him seeing the picture and
Mhm.
recognizing I've seen
Yeah.
that man before.
Yeah. Yeah. Dan.
Yeah, and Joe handled it remarkably well, but we're also seeing that after he'd had some time
Exactly.
to process it.
You're right.
And,
You're right.
when you open up those
Mhm.
ancestry results, you don't have time to process it. You're getting that in that moment, so it's not always going to be this
Yeah.
calm feeling. It
Yes.
can be, it's life altering.
Yep.
But it can really destroy as much as it can help, and people
Sure.
have to know that going into DNA testing before they
Sure.
think about it. So
I
Yeah.
tell people you don't ask the
full
question
story.
unless you're willing to take whatever
Yeah.
answer you get.
Yeah. Bernice, what were you saying?
was just saying, Joe's story just didn't end with his father.
Mhm.
No.
To his grandfather, and then the story of what happened with his grandfather.
Yes.
Him in a totally different
Yes.
direction, because I mean, many of us have heard about the Tuskegee,
Mhm.
but then to realize that you had an ancestor that was a part of that Tuskegee,
Right.
that's
Right.
heart wrenching. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. And I think anytime that we we discover records that show that our ancestors were part of something that we've heard about before, some kind of historical thing, especially things that are traumatic, it's traumatic. I mean, you want to say, oh, they were part of this and that was really wonderful and they're a hero and all that kind of thing. It makes us feel good. And then when we find out that they were part of things that were, I mean, it was horrific what they did to his grandfather. I mean, and all those men. So to find that out, but he, he had a really good attitude, I thought, as they moved back farther into his family line, and they discovered that he had an ancestor that fought for the Confederacy. You know, he thought, you know, and that one, Bernice, if you want to talk about that story about what he found out about that man. But I just want to say, and then one more line back, he found out that he had an ancestor that was a loyalist during the Revolutionary War. So he's just like, oh well. But people do what they do with the time that they do it.
Yes, the more you dig, the more.
That's right. That's right.
One thing that I noticed for both of the guests, their ancestors were from Edgefield.
And that is so wonderful, because Bernice is from Edgefield.
No, my ancestors are from
Well,
Edgefield.
well, you know what I'm saying. Your ancestors are from it, and so are mine. So are some of mine. So, but Bernice caught it. See, that was one of the things I said. Sometimes you can watch a show more than once and not catch it. I must have been, you know, I heard him say South Carolina for Taya, and I must have written down South Carolina, then didn't see the tree. So, but
The tree, I wanted to see.
you wanted to see it, yeah. And I looked, and I didn't. After you reminded me and told me, I looked at that tree and I didn't see any familiar names. But that doesn't mean they don't connect somewhere. But yeah, so that's another cool thing too, is watch where they're going, watch where those trees are going. Mary?
Well, and look at the familiar names. I mean, they showed for Joe's family, they showed a 1900 and a 1910 census.
Yes.
And I know, you know, they got a finite amount of time, so they can't
Yes.
go into all of it. But there were other. They were researching the Haygood family, and there were other Haygood on that page.
On that page. See, Mary goes back and looks at the documents a lot of times. And we love that, because she always comes and brings us information that we didn't know, because they can't put like she said, they can't put everything in the show. A lot of stuff ends up, you know, on the cutting room floor, but she's so right. Always
Any
go back and look.
genealogist out there that's
Yeah.
looking for their family, don't just stop with those 5 lines that are your family. You really want to look at that page and
Exactly.
a few before and a few after.
Exactly. Yeah.
The census taker's walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard, and you got other relatives in that neighborhood.
Exactly. Laura, did you want to say something?
Yeah, one of the things I thought was interesting from both a DNA and a records research thing is they feature the fact we can't always get the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciated that, because I think there's this thing that we're going to do a DNA test and it's going to all magically be found out.
Exactly.
And I think if I'm recalling correctly, he said no one in the family could figure out how Joe's biological dad met his mom.
Right. Because remember, we talked about that. They're supposed to be in the same place at the same time.
Well, they figured out
obviously they were. Yeah,
they
the same
were in
city.
Dayton. Yeah,
right.
They narrowed it down to a city.
Yeah.
But not the story.
Not the story. Yeah.
What happened? Why did it happen? How did it happen?
Right.
The kind of stuff. And I think, you know, that's just a reality. We have to not have the answer.
Exactly.
We can't always have the answers.
Well,
even if we use DNA.
Right. And sometimes with DNA matches, it can be years before somebody else, the right person, connects.
Oh, I know.
And those
I'm
matches.
so annoyed. I had my husband's uncle, I think it's been 6 years he's been out there with his Y DNA test.
Oh.
Not another male Tufts not another Y. He's got no Y matches.
Oh my gosh.
And right. And so I'm looking, oh, he's got 12. Jeez.
Oh
So
my
that
gosh.
was really, I think too, yeah, that was lucky that there was a whole
That there
lot
was
of
a
people
whole
that had been,
bunch.
a lot of Y DNA tests
Mm-hmm.
that were out there.
Yeah.
And but the thing that I do find, I wonder about is when Cece does her building the trees up,
Mm-hmm.
I find that so hard a lot of times. I get DNA matches and they have, 3 people in their tree and 2 of them are private. Just, how am I going to build that up? And I'm thinking she has like private detective databases or something.
She's got all the secret ways to do it.
I've been doing so much of that lately. I'm working on a unknown parentage case from 1820, and I am building so many trees back. And yeah, you get those, but if you, I just find, even sometimes if you got one name,
Mm-hmm.
and they died in 1973,
Yep.
lots of times you can get moving on that.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Bernice, you actually have the hey good, hey good, hey word, hey, that branch of the family. You've got DNA.
Yes, I have DNA matches, so I have to go back and start writing them. Several. I mean, it's not one, it's several.
Wow. Huh.
Interesting.
Wow. Do you have a Detroit connection? That would be interesting if you were connected to that family itself.
No, that's why I have to go back and
start looking and see if you do.
Mm-hmm.
That would be really.
Georgia? It wasn't Detroit.
I thought that's it might maybe
Dayton, Ohio.
Dayton, Ohio. That's what it was. It was Dayton, not Detroit. It was Dayton. Sorry. Thank you, Mary.
South Carolina.
Right. Thank you, Mary. Had the wrong D name word. D name down. So, yeah, you have to. Yeah. So that would be interesting if you could find that connection.
Yes, it would. It would.
Now he had a really interesting story. Once they found out who his grandfather was, that was an interesting story about how he came about, who he was living with, and how that whole generation came to be. Anybody want to discuss that story about how they were neighbors, but
Is this the permanent resident of the hotel part?
well, there was that part.
That was her family.
That was her.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was her family.
Okay.
That was her family. But with his family, good, Bernice, were you going to say something?
They were living next door to each other.
They were living next door to each other. Exactly.
Right.
And it turns out that he had, remember we talked about that Civil War ancestor? Well, he was living next, he came home, he was injured in the war, and he came home and I guess fell in love with the woman next door who happened to be African American. And so it was an interesting story because that was 10 years later that was in the 1900 census. They were living next door to each other. And then the 1910 census, he was living with his father. So apparently his father, because it was written in the census, that was his son. So apparently the community knew, he wasn't hiding it, he had accepted him as his son. And on top of that, didn't they have like 6 children together?
Yeah, and that's where I was saying with that census record in 1900. So the mom was there with, I think, 5 children.
Okay.
And the way it was listed on the census. The dad, the white man, was the line right above. Right above. But then the family above him was the oldest child of that couple.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
He was married, and his wife and one.
Oh, okay. So he'd grown up.
And then in the 1910 census, so he was married. So obviously that couple had been together for a long time. For
quite a while.
Had, married children together.
Yes.
And then in 1910, it was, when you look at the census record, mom is not in the picture, and they didn't go into whether she had died or what the deal was. But dad is there, and one son is listed. And then he's sort of crossed out. There's a little arrow because he's also in the next household with his wife and children.
Oh.
So there was really quite a story in those census records that they just didn't elaborate on in the show. But, you know, the DNA was more interesting probably than some old dusty census record.
Oh, I don't know. We can find some really good things out of those old dusty census records, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, and that just goes to show too that as you are working on this DNA, you've got to use your records too. You've got to. They go hand in hand. And I mean, I know some DNA experts are like, it's the records, people. You can use all those crazy tools you want, but it's the records. Once you get those matches, you really need those records. So I think that's important to know, because a lot of people will get those matches, those connections, and they're like, okay, we're related, and they don't move forward and try to figure out how with the records. So has anybody else got anything else that they could think of that they really liked about the show?
I wanted to say just one thing about the DNA that I thought was interesting with Taya Leone, is she was very, very interested in who her mother's mother was.
Yes.
And they got that answer
right
away. And then, you know, later he said, really want to know about your mom's mom, but you really didn't even seem to ask about the dad. And the kind of, I don't know, the way they did the editing or whatever it was, it almost was like that they had to find the mom first in order to find the dad, and that's just not the way it works. Your DNA isn't color coded when you get it. And so
wouldn't that be nice?
One unknown parent, and then once you figure out the gender of whichever one you figure out first, then you know what the other one's got to be. But
then you can.
They were looking at matches, and they didn't know if they were looking for a mom or dad when Cece was originally going through those matches.
This is true. This is true.
A parent.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I think she appreciated knowing, and she said, you know, I didn't even think about that all this time. I just thought about her being, you know, an unwed mother, and well, yeah, but still, somebody had to father this child. So yeah, I do think it was really, really interesting that she just was really focused on who the mom was and not who the dad was. So, you know, maybe she was worried that it would be some kind of trauma kind of thing, you know, as far as who the dad was or something like that. So it's really interesting. It's very interesting to me to find out why people want to know what they want to know as well. You know, the whole, you know, thing about building the house and the family creating the home, the adopted family building the home is, you know, her mom didn't want to know. Her mom just didn't want to know. Laura?
I thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I love the analogy of the family that raised her was the family that made the house the home.
Right.
But what I liked even more it just really resonated me at the end when he asked her, you know, to know that your ancestors did some really bad things, does that change how you feel about yourself?
That's right.
And she answered like that. Like, and she said, I wish I had written it down, but she said,
I may have.
we're not, basically our DNA, our blood, we're not limited by that.
Oh, exactly. Yep.
But we can never divorce ourselves from our history. We have to face it.
Sure.
So it was really a cool way of looking at both sides of that coin, of facing our history,
right,
but yet looking at it with equanimity or something to say, okay, this is our history. This is what happened.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean I'm good. It doesn't mean I'm bad.
Exactly.
It's
and what she was
it.
Right. Yes. And what she was referring to is the records that Bernice was talking about earlier as they went back up the family tree, and she had ancestors from Edgefield County in South Carolina, and the records clearly showed that her ancestors were slave owners. And so, you know, a lot of us find that out, and, you know, it's hard to deal with. So just as DNA brings up so many emotions when you get your results, when those results are not quite what you thought they were going to be, finding records sometimes does the same thing, because we're finding out, I mean, I think we all just romanticize our ancestors, and they're all these wonderful wonderful people who did all these wonderful things, and you're going to find out you've got these patriots and heroes and all these people, you know, in your background, and you're going to be so proud of them. And then you start finding out, oh, they were human beings and did things that maybe they, you know, we don't appreciate that they did,
Or
and we've got
even
to
worse,
deal with that.
or even worse, they were victims. I mean,
Exactly. Or the
I don't know
victims
quite
of,
how
yeah.
to think of that protectiveness that you can feel for someone who's already gone.
Yes.
I don't
Yeah.
really know how to articulate that, but that's a hard thing to cope
Yeah.
with as well, is this after the fact wanting to advocate for them.
And say, oh, yeah, I'm so sorry this happened to you, or, you know, what can I do? Well, what you can do is write their story, I suppose, and make sure their names live on in history, you know, and so they're never forgotten. That to me would be the best thing that you could do for the, you know, ancestors that you find those type of things have happened to. So anybody else? I thought it was a really good episode. I really do think it really brought that DNA and the emotion, as Bernice was talking about, and the records that we need to help prove. You know, we can get all the matches that we want, but if people aren't in the same place at the same time, it makes it very difficult to say, yes, I've definitely found. Because sometimes there can be 3 or 4 brothers in a family, and you're not quite sure which one, but you also can see if you can find there. That's another part of that whole step, that once you find who you think the match is, I mean, the biological person is, if they had children, then you test their children and see who's got the closest match. And then sometimes you can determine a specific father. Sometimes you can't.
So I have a question for those of you that do client work.
Uh-huh.
I know, like, if somebody said Finding Your Past, this TV show that we want you to do your test, I mean, the probability is pretty high that they're going to say yes. What is the realistic thing when you go out and you approach someone and you want them to be tested?
Oh, I see. If you walk up to somebody and say, hey.
Well, not walk up, but as you're writing them and saying, yeah, you're a possible match for a client. I'd like you to take a test. What kind of responses do you get?
Well, usually I have my clients contact them. Anytime I find a connection, I have them make that. I learned a long time ago from Cece, who said, you don't do that yourself. You have your client contact those people. You're not a psychologist, you're not a middleman. You just have found the people. Now it's up to them to go and make that connection. And I have had several clients who have been very successful, and then I've had some clients who just get ghosted. No, people won't talk to them anymore once they, you know, you say, I think we're connected through this line. Would you be willing to do DNA? And some people are very excited and they want to do it. And some people, depending on who you are and what they think you want to know, or, you know, I think some people get scared off and you just don't hear from them again. But I think a lot of people will do it, especially if you pay for that test and send it to them. So I know Bernice has tested a lot of people.
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So did you, how did that go for you, contacting people saying, I need you to test?
They said, okay.
Did you say, I'm going to send you the kit?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think it
but
just.
I didn't manage the kit. You know, I'll send you the kit, but it's still your responsibility. And if you want
yes,
turn this over to me to manage, I will let you ask for permission.
Exactly.
No.
Exactly. Dan, you had a comment?
Yeah, so I actually had a client that hired me to do it in reverse. She had been contacted by a number of people that she was ghosting, and she wanted to know if this was legitimate.
Oh,
and so
that's interesting.
And so she hired me to do it. Before, she didn't respond to a single one of them, and so she hired me to do the work in reverse that they were probably paying somebody else to do.
As long as everybody's making money.
Exactly.
You know, and I wasn't hired by any of the other people. That would have been a conflict of interest, and I would have had to disclose that. But she hired me to do that, and you know, and to see how if these
Yeah.
people were just, because her immediate thought was, just like anybody that knocks on your door asking for money or asking for something, there's always a catch. There's always a
Always a
gimmick. And so
catch. Yeah.
she was concerned that she was being hacked by, you know, Ukrainian spies trying to get her access to her DNA results on Ancestry. And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure that they've got bigger fish to fry than your DNA, but let's go for it, you know. And
Very
so
interesting.
I worked the trees.
Yeah.
You know, obviously we knew that these people had already been tested down to a current level, and so we just sort of built it back, and
Great.
you know, and was able to demonstrate how they're related, and just left it with her.
Yeah.
And just said, here you go. If you choose to respond back, here's.
But now you've got more information.
Now you've got more information,
Exactly.
on if you want to or if you don't want to.
Well,
And
Dan,
so,
I think that's a really good point, though, because perhaps if those people had given her more information when they asked her to begin with, she wouldn't have ghosted them. Because I know we all get those little emails saying, hello, I think we're related. And that's it. They don't tell you how. They don't give you enough information. So I think that the more information you can give someone, the better your chances are they're going to answer you back. Because frankly, I don't have time to figure out how you think we're related. You know what I mean?
It's sometimes I don't even know who you're talking about when you send me the emails, because I have like 20 different DNA kits on Ancestry. It's like, yeah, we're a match. It's like, okay, who are you a match with?
Exactly.
So you really need to give, I match with so-and-so, and we share, you know, this amount of DNA, this number of centimorgans. And, you know, when somebody emails me out of the blue and says, yeah, we share 7 centimorgans, it's like, okay, good.
Okay.
No, thank you.
Sorry, yeah, Dan?
Well, I think we have to approach different potential relationships differently, right? Like if you're approaching somebody and you say, hey, I think we're related because you're my dad, that's probably not the best way to approach that email. But if it's a third cousin or a fourth cousin,
right?
Or then sure. But even if it's a first cousin, because I think most of us are aware of who our purported first cousins are.
Purported.
And if
Purported, yeah.
Right, and if a new one crops up, that means we have to think, what does this mean, right? Most of us know where, and even most of us will know the vast majority of our second cousins.
Right.
And so if a second cousin match comes up and we're like, who's this person? that's another one where we may need to approach it with a little bit more caution and tact than, hey, you want to figure out how we're related? You know, we share, you know, 9 centimorgans on, you know, 4 different sites, you know, like that's, come on, that's, you know, all of us share that, but like, you know, just, you know, the closer the relationship, the more caution we have to show in making those contacts. And so
I agree, we do, but give them enough so they're going to be curious enough to want to work together with you instead of just we match.
Right, yeah, and if you have a misattributed parentage, don't you know,
don't spit that out at the beginning.
Right. That should
build a relationship first.
Right. That shouldn't be like the topic of your email. Like, you're my dad. You know, like, hey, I see that we're connected on Ancestry. Would you like to discover how? You know, like.
But it would be cool to know how they worded it, because in Joe's case, they said these 4 brothers were being tested. Or no, they're 4 cousins, right?
4 cousins, yeah.
Because we suspect one of your dads had some extracurricular activities.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know how they worded that, yeah.
Right, but I mean, I think it was Laura that pointed out there's definitely a bias when it's a TV show asking.
Exactly.
And when it's just an unknown person, you know.
Yep.
For instance, I had someone come to the door once, and they were with the FBI, and they were doing a background check on someone that I knew from church, a young man that had joined the military and was going to be getting a certain clearance level, and they needed to do some investigation.
Yeah.
And so that was different than if it was just like, hey, we've got some questions, you know, like that you know, there was a different level of authority than if it just would have been some person, you know, in a t-shirt and shorts, like, hey, I work for the FBI. It's like, no, you don't. I've seen the X-Files. I know how you guys dress, you know? You do not wear Nirvana t-shirts and shorts. Like that's not how you dress. You have a dress code. Thank you.
It's a good point. It's a good
Yeah.
point. I'm sure the minute they heard, hey, we're from the, show Finding Your Roots, and we're
Yeah.
trying to discover, we need your spit, they probably, said, yeah, that would be great. So.
Because one of those people then had to figure out their father
Exactly.
fathered someone else.
Exactly. Yeah.
And people's
Absolutely.
decisions to say yes to that could depend on their own image of their father, of saying,
True.
well, my dad, that couldn't be my dad. My dad was a deacon at the church. He couldn't have possibly have done that.
Yep.
And but they only knew their dad from, the time that they were really, what's the first recollection you have of your dad? Maybe when you're like 5 or 6, right? That you can think back to remember. So most of us don't know our dads until they're maybe in their 30s, and they had a whole decade of other things that they could have been doing. And so we have to think about that, that, people may not want to do it for a number of reasons, and not just because they're obstinate, or they think that, they're being hacked by Ukrainian spies, or that the government's going to somehow do something with their DNA.
Their DNA.
Like,
However, did you notice at the very end, because he gets to go and meet his siblings, that one of them said, oh, we found out we have a large family now. So it made me wonder if perhaps there was some family story about his wandering ways. I've got an ancestor that had some wandering ways, and several children I keep finding out that we didn't know about. So, but I know the story. So if somebody came to me and said, hey, I think, if I hadn't tested, would you test because we may be connected in this way? I go, well, we probably do. Here's my spit. And so that may have been what happened in this case. There may have been some family story. I just think it was really funny how they were guffawing over the fact that they have a very large family.
I've got one that I just can't wait for another child to show up, because I'm sure there's got to be another one out there.
Right. So it may not have come that much of a surprise to them as it did to Joe, is what I'm trying to say. You just never know. So, well, this has been really fun. Does anybody else have anything else they wanted to bring out about the episode? I think it brought out some really good points, as we've talked about the DNA, the records, the emotions that it can bring, and then how to go about asking and getting help when you find those DNA matches. So thanks, everybody. I sure appreciate y'all being here on the panel, and I thank everybody for watching, and we'll see you next time on GenFriends. Bye, everybody.
Bye.